Dan, that rousing applause and those clips that Don shared are a testament to your legendary career. And I want to talk about that career and talk about your views on current day politics, which I know our audience is very anxious to hear. Let me go back, as we saw those clips, I want to just talk about a couple of moments within them. And the first one is the Kennedy assassination. You were the one who reported to Walter Cronkite in that iconic scene where he removes his glasses and talks about the fact that President Kennedy is dead. You were there on the scene. What was that moment like?
Well, it's been a long time ago, and as one gets older, memories fade. But the memories of the Kennedy assassination, almost every second of those 4 dark days in Dallas, are pretty vivid in my memory. Keep in mind that I was still a junior CBS News correspondent. I had been with the network for less than 2 years. I was given this assignment in Dallas as a routine assignment, mostly because I was a Texan. But you asked me what the moment was like, that while there was some anticipation that there might be some protest against President Kennedy, nobody expected an assassination attempt.
Right.
It wasn't on my mind when I planned the coverage. And it was frankly, an emotional earthquake on a personal basis when it became obvious that the president was dead, that as with anybody else, I had to wrestle with myself for at least a few seconds, I would say more than a few seconds. But at that point, it's the proverbial why. You're either going to succumb to your own emotions, which the nation did almost as one, or you're going to say to yourself, this may be the biggest story I ever cover, and let's get zone-like focused on the story at hand. And it was, frankly, when I said that the president is dead, I said that first to the radio desk, and you asked me how I felt. I didn't really think it through. I was methodically telling them why I knew he was dead to the radio desk. And the next thing I know, they're playing the national, and an announcer is saying that, Dan Rather reports the president is dead. On the television side, they knew about it almost immediately, but there was some question as to whether they would go with it or not. But if you take my point of what I felt my initial feeling was, boy, have I fouled up here. This may be the end of my career.
Right.
I mean, I knew the story was true. There wasn't any question about that.
Right.
But when television sort of flinched, the television side flinched a little bit and didn't go with it immediately, and it was later explained to me they didn't have any doubts either. They were just wondering what the impact would be. But I would say overall that I was emotionally drained after those 4 days.
Right.
But I think what hit the hammer to the heart that hit most people at the time the president was assassinated, his assassin was assassinated, and we had the funeral in Washington. At that time, I was able, and I think most reporters they were, able to push down my own emotional feelings. And it was a week, maybe 8 or 9 days afterward, that I gave in to my emotional side. But as with most journalists, Mark, you asked me what I felt. There was this immediate, God, this is terrible for the country and what's going on, who's responsible for this. But as a reporter, you're trained, nothing aces the story. If you're on a story, you have to get completely mesmerized, focused on the story. And after the first, certainly few minutes, maybe a few seconds, that's what was foremost in my mind.
So Americans, world citizens of a certain age, remember that where they were when they heard the news that President Kennedy was dead. And I think folks of a certain age remember where they were when 9/11 happened. Right. We saw that footage from 9/11 toward the end of those clips. Talk about your feelings on that day.
Well, on 9/11, each story is unique unto itself. And with the Kennedy assassination, it was, boom, the president's dead. And there was, for the 4 or 5 days, it was a running story. And you knew it would have reverberations for the rest of your life. But with 9/11, the destruction was so great, including the death and injury, that you knew this story was going to go on for weeks, if not months, as the #1 story in the world. But I remember when I got to the broadcast center just after the second plane had hit, and I was about to go up to the anchor desk. The anchor desk is somewhat elevated in the newsroom, and there's a routine. Each anchor has his own set routine, in which mine is I have an earpiece in my left ear that goes to the control room, which controls the photographs, the pictures, and I have an earpiece in my right ear, which they run the cords down, which goes to the editorial desk, and that's the way I operate in the anchor chair. But I remember, it's an unfair comparison, but it's a miniature feeling like an astronaut. You've got to get hooked up, and you kind of ascend to this thing. But I remember doing 2 things. One, I made a quick call to my wife, Fighting Heart Jeannie Grace Goebel, rather, who is here tonight with me, because thank you. I just make a quick call to Jeannie because I knew once I took air, there was going to be very little time to make any other calls. And yes, I said a quick prayer. And then got up, and once in the chair, then again, your experience, for good and not so good, takes over. Right. But those were the things I was thinking. But as the story developed, as one tower went down, another tower went down, there was talk of the death toll might be as much as 10,000. It's the only time I can remember on the anchor desk, and I was honored to be Walter Cronkite's successor. In my mind, I never said replacement. You don't replace an idol. But I had anchored quite a bit before then. It's the only time I can remember that there were moments in the early hours of 9/11 when my knees began to shake underneath the anchor chair, and I was saying mentally to myself, I can't let this show. I mean, I've got to stop it down in here underneath the desk. It's the only time in my experience when I have any memory of that happening.
You once said that you wished you had reined your passions in a bit more at times when you're reporting. And Don mentioned you are the greatest investigative journalist of your generation. That's hard to argue. How do you rein in your passion? You obviously have feelings as a human being, and you come to the story with those, with a certain point of view, in a certain emotional state. How do you reconcile that when you're doing a story?
Well, I don't always reconcile it, and I don't think it's possible to do it every day, every moment, on every story. To answer your question, that I've never advertised myself, nor do I want to be a robot. I always wanted the viewer, the listener, for that matter, to know that he's a person, he's a human being. This is not robotized. But I was trained as a journalist that insofar as it's humanly possible, that you should keep your own feelings, your biases, your prejudices, any strong feelings you have about a story to yourself, realizing that you cannot do it, as I say, every day in every way on every story. But I was raised in a school of journalism that says, but that is over a period of time, not on any one given story, but over a period of time, you want to be okay with having people judge you over a number of times. How hard does he try to be an honest broker of information? And how often does he succeed? And that's the standard by which I wanted to be judged. And I know different people judge it in a different way, but that's what I was trying to do. And I think so often we journalists don't try to explain to our public what it is we're trying to do. That's what I've always tried to do. You can't always do it. I never wanted to show emotion on the air. And for example, through almost all of 9/11, I held it in pretty well. When the first time I left the studio, I went to David Letterman's studio,
right.
which was not my turf in a way, and I really surprised myself. But I've never apologized for that breaking down on the Letterman program, because you shouldn't apologize for grief, and that's what it was.
It seems like that program, that was an outlet for all of us, because we were watching the news, we were trying to make sense of it. You go on David Letterman, and we saw in you the emotions that we all felt. And it seems like you let your guard down at that point. Because why is that? Why was that environment conducive?
Well, I think because, as I say, that I was disciplining myself in my own studio at CBS News World headquarters on 57th Street, and that was my environment all day, every day for well over a week, I guess it was, except for I'd slip home in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock and maybe sleep for an hour and a half or 2 hours and then get back. So the point is that it surprised me what happened on the Letterman program. I didn't plan it. I didn't say to myself, well, okay, I can relax. It's just I had my own work in my own environment, and suddenly it said, Dan, it's time to go over to the Letterman program. So without thinking, if I had thought it through, it might not have happened. But I got there sort of hurriedly, and the next thing you know, you're on the program, the next thing we're talking about it. And the most surprised person in the room was myself when that happened. And David understood and handled it very well. But I come back to, in the initial moments, I was saying to myself, no, I shouldn't have done that, and I'm sorry that it happened. But very quickly, I just said to myself, well, you know, you held grief in for a long time, and you kind of let your guard down unknowingly, and your grief showed, and you shouldn't be ashamed of that, and I'm not. Wasn't then, and I'm not now.
Yeah. What makes you a great reporter?
Well, first of all, and I don't mean this in any false humility way, I'm still trying to become a great reporter. I think
As that reel clearly showed, Dan.
Well, one argument, again, I'm not, as I said earlier, you know, I'm not going to just look down at my boots and run my hand around the brim of my hat and say, oh, shucks.
Right.
I certainly want to be a great reporter,
yeah.
and that's what I'm aspired to be. But, you know, I've been so lucky in so many ways, including I have worked among genuinely great reporters. In the electronic news era, Edward R. Murrow, in my opinion, not only was the founding saint of electronic journalism as we know it, but was an unbelievably high-quality practitioner of the trade for a very long time. Obviously, Walter Cronkite, Eric Severide. Here's the point that I am, I hope, understandably proud of some things I've done, but I want to be the best. I mean, who doesn't want to be the best in his profession? But I know my shortcomings, and you know, as we said here, I think it's very important for the audience to understand that I fully know that, you know, I've made my share of mistakes, and I have my wounds to show it, some of them self-inflicted wounds, and some of them still open wounds. I have no illusion. And so I always appreciate someone saying you're a great reporter. I'd like to say, even in my 85th year, well, that's where I'm trying to be. I will say that as a very young person, that I set as my navigational star, my polar star, to always be moving toward, that I wanted to be a great world-class reporter.
Right. How would you characterize the state of journalism today?
Well, it's in a state of flux. Journalism today, particularly American journalism, but I think in many ways it applies worldwide. We're in a period of transition, and a very difficult period of transition. It's what I would call an interregnum. That's a term. I'm not Catholic, but it's a Roman Catholic Church term, which is very handy for describing where we are, which is the old order is dead or going,
right,
and the new order is not yet in place. So we're in this interregnum, which is a very difficult period. And the core of it is, for a long time there was a business model that would support journalism that was targeted in the public interest and would finance even the most expensive kinds of journalism, deep digging investigative reporting and first-class international reporting, what we used to call foreign news.
Right.
That business model is pretty much shot. And nobody, with very few exceptions, in fact, nobody's figuring on an ongoing, sustained basis what the new business model would be that could finance and sustain a business enterprise that, yes, makes money, if you will, but sees news as in the public service, in the public interest, and can finance a worldwide news gathering organization. What's happened over the last 10 or 15 years, accelerated in the last few years, as we've moved into the digital age, is so many what used to be news gathering institutions have become news packaging institutions.
Right.
That place after place, whether it's some local television stations or network news organizations, or for that matter, once great newspapers with worldwide reach, they aggregate other people's news that other people have gathered now, rather than gathering news themselves.
The Huffington Post model, for instance.
Yes.
Yeah. And would you, if your grandchild came to you and asked if they should go into journalism, what would your advice be?
Well, as a matter of fact, that question is pretty close to the bone, because I have a 19-year-old grandson who's just about done that. Well, I wouldn't discourage them, and I wouldn't encourage them. I would say the two things that even people not related to me, young students, I frequently say, well, the first thing is to determine whether you have the passion for it.
Yeah.
Journalism isn't the only profession or craft, but it's one of the professions of craft that to succeed, whatever your definition of succeed may be, you must burn with a hot, hard flame to do it. You must almost see it as a mission in life, as your destiny to do it. And the reason for that is that it's very tough to get a start in journalism. It's very hard to make a living for a while in journalism. I know you're saying, well, Dan, you did all right, but that's true, but that's the exception. Yeah. It's a version of what I would tell that grandson of the student as. So you must ask yourself, do I have that passion? Realizing that journalism, it can be a great adventure, it can be a great career, but it's one that's going to be held on relationships. Journalism is hard on, family relationships, romantic relationships, any kind of relationships, because the story dominates. And stories tend, sometimes they break on Christmas, New Year's, anniversary, birthday, childbirth times, all of those things. And you have to blow and go. So first thing is, do you burn with a hot, hard passion to do it, or do you believe that you could develop that kind of passion? That's the first question. And the second question would be, are you prepared to dedicate yourself to a lifetime of trying to improve your writing? Because writing is the bedrock of the craft. And I don't say that to a young person who's interested in journalism, I don't want to discourage one who says, well, I don't write very well, so I probably shouldn't get in it. I would say, no, don't let that be a barrier. Just realize that you're going to have to work very hard to become an increasingly better writer all of the time. I'm still trying to make myself a better writer. So those two things are what I'd say to anyone, including my grandson who was interested.
Right. When you look at the broad media landscape, we have more media outlets today than we've ever had. Where do you put social media, talk radio, things that are not traditional media outlets, media vehicles? How do you define the media landscape, is I guess what I'm asking.
Well, it's very hard to define it now because it's changing so rapidly that trying to define it, trying to get your head around it, if you will, and get it in some perspective and context, a favorite word of mine, is sort of like trying to change the fan belt on a moving Mercedes. That's just, you're constantly trying to shift with it. But in trying to answer your question, that things like talk radio, social media, I think can be an asset to a news consumer, but only if you're prepared and can take the time to be very discerning. Mm-hmm. That not confined to talk radio, or for that matter to social media, So much of what now is advertised as news is not news. It's not a news program. It's not intended to be. It's intended to be entertainment. If you stop and think about it, you see it all the time. On cable television, on radio, something is billed as, quote, a news program. But it is, in fact, designed to be and is, in fact, entertainment. People shouting at one another or dealing in the latest tabloid stories rather than important stories. But I don't want to digress from the point that perhaps this is a biased point of view, and understandably because I am a journalist. But I think now more than ever, we need a definition of what is journalism, who is a journalist and who isn't. Because in the expanded media world that we're dealing in now, so many places advertising themselves as news outlets and what have you, that somebody needs to be the gatekeeper, if you will. Now, some people don't like the phrase gatekeeper. What it is, I'll use this analogy, that if your car engine has some difficulty, you want an experienced, trained mechanic. You don't just call your neighbor over and say, listen, I hear a knock on my engine, can you get underneath there and fix it? Or if you need to have surgery, you want somebody standing over you with a scalpel who's had those years of training and had experience. You don't want your Uncle Jake doing the surgery. Well, in the same way, I think some people need to be trained, some people need to have the experience to earn the title of journalist and to work to have the title of journalism. But building that kind of respect in today's environment is extremely difficult.
That might be a great dovetail into the current election.
All right.
Let me read a tweet from one of the candidates. I quote, "If the disgusting and corrupt media covered me honestly and didn't put false meaning into the words I say, I could be beating Hillary by 20%. There is this illusion that, well, I don't know if it's illusion, has been talk for years and years and years about the liberal media. You hear something enough times and it becomes an article of faith. Is the media liberally biased, in your view?
I recognize I may be a bad one to ask, but because of so many people's perceptions, that my answer is no. I know widely believed it may be, but true it is not. For one thing, even the terms liberal and conservative don't mean much anymore. What I learned early as a reporter is to ask people, I don't plead with people, give me a subject and I'll tell you where I stand. For example, when people say, Dan, you're the most liberal person I ever ran across. My mail runs this way sometimes. But I ask people, well, first of all, take a look at my biography, which is not the standard biography. For one thing, many people say, well, beginning you're a privileged person because you went to Harvard. I didn't go to Harvard. I went to Sam Houston State Teachers College, which has about as much ivy on it as your average McDonald's. And I say that with some pride, not meaning to denigrate. But frequently people say, well, tell me where you do stand. Well, among other things, I'm for strong defense, I'm for clean air and water, and for tight money. Now, whatever that makes me, I guess that's what I am.
Right.
But back to your question about liberal bias. I think what happens is, it has happened, this has happened over the span of my lifetime. When I first started in journalism, this idea that journalists were liberal or left-wing was only beginning. It really began during the McCarthy period. What is true is that most journalists spend an apprenticeship developing in their craft and their profession, in which you see a part of life that most people never see. That is a beginning reporter. You see what happens at the police station after midnight on Saturday night. You see the emergency room at the charity hospital on any weekend. As part of your work, you go into neighborhoods where poverty is deep and abiding. You also go into meetings in which race hatred is so deep you can almost literally cut through it. The point is that as a reporter in your apprenticeship, it's less true today than it used to be, but it's still true. You see a kind of Dickensian side of life that most other people never see, at least not in entirety. And by the way, I haven't even talked about war. I mean, to see the savagery, the madness of war up close and personal, not as a combatant, but as an observer, you have these experiences. So there is a tendency to identify with the underdog. There is a tendency to, or at the very least to say, you know, folks, you need to pay some attention to this. And those who are opposed to that have to stick some label on you. So it became fairly popular first in the late 40s, early 50s, accelerated during the Nixon administration, to say, if you call them liberal, that's a kind of dog whistle to people that they're leftist, and, you know, maybe a little pink, if not red.
Right.
And that caught on and has taken root. But my experience with reporters, by and large, again, it may be hard to believe, but true it is. Most of the reporters I've worked with, including up to now, are, when I say they're apolitical, they're interested in politics, but they are rarely into partisan political acts of any kind. And as a matter of fact, sort of have a built-in antenna against partisan political activity of certain extreme sorts, and are not ideological about things. But I sometimes think I'm preaching into a wind tunnel, because the climate has been created where when a Donald Trump says, what did he say, something about dangerous and corrupt or whatever, well, I guess someone else might say, I'm willing to accept Donald Trump as an authority on what's corrupt. But this is sort of standard fare, because it is part of why Donald Trump has succeeded up to now.
Right.
That is, he's been very good about taking the scent from a wide swath of American life where people are afraid, they're angry, they're resentful. In some cases, in too many cases, race is a factor. And they particularly, this is the swath of Americans, they are opposed to what they see as the elites. And so anytime Donald Trump can hang that sign around you, liberal, elite, part of what needs to be changed, he thinks he's an advantage. But, you know, my experience over the years, and we've been, as journalists, you know, like everybody else, been through a lot. I can smile and say, I have tremendous faith in the American people to, in the end, make the right decisions. Now, who knows who's going to win this election next Tuesday? I don't. I do. I think it's still volatile. I still think it can go either way. We can talk about that if you like. But, you know, my experience, which is now getting to be a fairly long time, is that the country is capable of making mistakes, even big mistakes, but overall in the main we'll get it right. And my experience as a journalist is, let's face it, I've been accused of almost everything over the course of a lifetime, which is an inevitable result of being on big stories. You cover the civil rights in the South in the 60s, you cover the Vietnam War, Watergate, and so forth. You're going to have people call you names. But my experience has been that people pretty much sort it out.
Yeah.
People figure out when you make a mistake, they'll be quick to call your hand on it. But they also are quick to forgive if they think you're really trying to do quality work.
Trump is now blaming the media for his standing in the race. But to what extent is the media responsible for his political ascent?
Well, I think the media, I prefer the word press, but I take the point that
Sure.
media. I think the media, and I include myself in this, has a good deal to answer for in the rise of Donald Trump, particularly during the primary season. The reason for it is that we gave him almost unfettered access that he got by far the most free television time, by a factor of 10 at least, that any candidate for the presidency has ever had. The last estimate I saw, he got about $2 billion worth of free airtime. Maybe that estimate is right or not, but back to the point. Media has a lot to answer for by giving him unfettered access, overwhelming access to the airwaves. Now, they did so for understandable reasons. They did so for the money. I don't mean individual reporters, but the people who own the outlets of distribution. Donald Trump appearing on your air equaled immediate ratings jump.
Right.
Immediate ratings jump meant a raise in advertising rates, and it was about the money. With the possible exception of one of the television networks, I don't think anyone gave him this overwhelming access to airtime for any ideological or partisan political reason. I think it was about the money. So it has to answer that. I think this is a long list, and I'll keep it short as I can, but I think the media in general did far less investigative, really deep digging investigative reporting on the candidates, comparing what they said and what were facts, demonstrable facts, than has been done. Now, there have been some exceptions to that, and I give the exception credit, but overall in the main, it's been take the easy way. If a candidate starts talking about the other candidate's sexual preferences, then that's what we run with. If it's about emails, it's easy, but it's harder to dig. So missing the deep digging investigative reporting and missing the tough questioning. Again, there have been some exceptions, but by and large, both of the two major candidates have escaped any really hard questioning, asking tough question, following up on tough question, and following up on that until and unless it's clear the candidate's going to answer it. And that applies to Donald Trump, but also Hillary Clinton hasn't held a news conference, I think, in close to 2 years. So the press has not done a job, I think, about asking the tough questions.
But they also, it seems, treated Donald Trump with kid gloves because they didn't want to alienate him, knowing full well that if they had him on their air, they would get those eyeballs, they would get those viewers, and they would get that advertising revenue. Do you think that you've alluded to this, but I'll ask more directly, has the media treated Hillary Clinton responsibly?
Well, I think as a broad generality, I think they have done it responsibly. The problem areas are, in no particular order, one, what's become known as false equivalency.
Right.
That for a very long time in the campaign, there have been some changes late in the campaign, but to this day, there's a tendency to say, Donald Trump hasn't paid his taxes in 19 years, whatever it is. If we're going to run that story, then we have to run a negative story about Hillary Clinton. So we run a story, this is hypothetical, about she stumbles getting into her limousine. So there has been some false equivalency, I think, applied unfairly to Hillary Clinton. But again, I think it's very hard for the Clinton campaign to complain when they've tried to run a tightly controlled media operation in which they expose their candidate as little as possible to ground, to an environment in which they can have some control. But again, I don't want to engage myself in false equivalency here. That given his overall background, and while there has been some investigative reporting, I'll point to one thing specifically. What has happened with Vladimir Putin and the Russians' involvement in aiding and abetting the leaking of information damaging to the Clinton side. However you come out on Trump and Clinton, this is very serious to have a foreign power this deeply involved in trying to affect the outcome of an American election. Now, I don't want anybody walking out of here saying, well, Dan Rather's carrying Hillary Clinton's water for her. That's not the case. I think by any objective analysis, this, folks, is serious. What are the known facts on that? Now, in this week where the FBI director has chosen to release, including some new ones this very day, some new information about investigations done with the Clintons. On the other hand, what are the facts as the FBI knows them about the Russian case? I'm fairly deep into this, but I'm trying to make the point that I do think that Donald Trump overall and in the main, part of the keys to his rise has been free airtime.
Right.
Part of the key to his rise has been he's a master at social media. And the Clinton campaign has had a lot of money and a lot of expert people running the social media, but Donald Trump has dominated social media pretty much the way he has dominated television media. But the press is going to have a lot of questions to answer once the election's over on all sides.
Dan, put this election in context. Have we ever seen anything even remotely like this in your experience?
No. Not only, I would argue... No, look, every presidential election is important, and every presidential election is unique into itself. That's true. And but this election, not only have I never seen anything like this, but no American going back far 19th century, 18th century has seen anything like this. Now, well, okay, what's the supporting evidence of that? Well, in no particular order. First of all, although we have had nasty campaigns and nasty campaign practices before, never has such a low level of campaign discourse, so much instability, so much really terrible campaigning, negative campaigning been done on such a sustained basis. Yes, we've had campaigns before where people played dirty and people engaged in nasty, but I defy you to find any campaign in which it's been this down and low. Now, another second thing, no presidential campaign in history has ever had each of the two nominees of the major parties with negatives above 50%. Mm-hmm. There have been times when one party nominated a candidate who had fairly high negatives and the other medium negatives. But here, with each of the two major candidates, consistently, and about this at least the polls have been consistent, more than 50% of the population is negative about them. We've never had that happen before. And beyond that, other things that make it unique. And I don't leave any, about this, you can accuse me of being opinionated. I would argue that by any reasonable analysis, this has been what I think the Wall Street Journal called, this is a garbage dump fire. The whole campaign. And the Clinton people frequently argue, well, it was the Trump people who started it, but that's an old game. And we have to be careful if we're going to hold this constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy together, that this doesn't take hold to be the new normal, this campaign. What worries me most about the campaign, and I would say, you said what makes it different, that I would argue, and I'm not the only one, although I don't think it's reached majority opinion, that we're very close to having reached it with this campaign, a post-truth political era. A political era in which the truth doesn't matter, the facts don't matter. It's okay, we have to move beyond the truth. That's pretty scary for a country such as ours. If we in fact move deeply into a post-truth era, we're not going to like what the future does. So one can say maybe it'll be contained to just this, but I think looking ahead, that's what to be alert to, that we simply shouldn't and we can't move into a complete post-truth political era, but I think we're very close with this campaign to have done that.
So you have an electorate that is not motivated by the facts, but rather by passions, and we're seeing that in this race very clearly. So you've interviewed every president from Eisenhower forward, which is just absolutely astounding. You've seen presidents up close. Can the next president of the United States, whoever he or she is, can they unite this country given that passions run so deep?
Well, I think the answer is yes. But I will confess, if confess is the right verb, that I'm an optimist by experience and by nature. I think the next president of the United States, and I mean it, whomever is elected of the two finalists, has an opportunity to, as I like to say, to light a candle of hope, healing, and unity in the country. I do think this, yes. I think the majority of the country, by no means everybody, I think by the majority of the country is yearning for that. I think they're thirsting for that because I think they realize we need it. And a president has, among the president's powers, is the power to persuade. Mm-hmm. And I do think if the new president sets his or her mind to it, it will not be easy. But I think understanding of, look, I'm elected to be president of all the people of the United States, because let's just set it hypothetical. If Donald Trump loses, he still would have gotten no fewer than 36%, no less than 36%, perhaps 40 to 42% more. And if Hillary Clinton loses, she will have gotten at least 42, 44% of the vote. My point is that there's a tendency, particularly when you've had a very low-road campaign such as this, for the victor to say, okay, I want to deliver for my people. That would be particularly dangerous, I think, in this era. The new president coming in must say, I've got to be president of all the people, work on healing, fueling hope, healing, saying, look, we must be united on the most important things. We sit here in the Lyndon Johnson, the LBJ library, and Lyndon Johnson, who was by no means a perfect person, nor was he a perfect president. But Lyndon Johnson got arguably the most important domestic legislation of the 20th century, certainly some of it passed, because President Johnson, and I'm not patting my part here, that was around him quite a bit, and yes, I'm pleased to say, without bragging about it, knew him pretty well. President Johnson, what made him effective, what made him a can-do president insofar as he was, there'll always be Vietnam, but with domestic legislation, was he took the view with every single person who had a vote in the House or the Senate or anywhere he needed a vote, of okay, he sized up the person, then would actually talk to the person and the group the person represented and said, we disagree about 50 or 100 things. And we're not going to get very far if we spend our time arguing about this. Will you join me in finding one or two things where we can reach common ground and get something accomplished for our people? This was Lyndon Johnson at his best. There are plenty of examples of Lyndon Johnson in other contexts, of course. My point is that in recent presidencies and recent administrations, it's a combination of loss of desire to do it and the lack of ability to do it. Now, one reason I'm optimistic about the new presidency, partly because I think we have to be optimistic, but also even a small return to that, I think would pay big dividends of saying, look, let's don't talk about the intractable things about which we disagree. Can we find some common ground? And let's concentrate on that common ground. For example, infrastructure, rebuilding the infrastructure, is a possible place for common ground between a Democrat and Republican. And I'll give it just as one example.
I understand that the new president can and should try to unite the American people. Actually, I take it back. Let me question the can. Assuming Hillary Clinton becomes president, and that is an assumption. Can she unite the country when she has her vanquished opponent questioning the integrity of the voting system?
Well, under your hypothetical, and I want to make it very clear, this is very hypothetical at this stage because I do think the race is very volatile. My own opinion is it still could go either way. But let's take your hypothetical. if the loser does that, it will make it extremely difficult for the new president to accomplish what I outlined as possible. And this is a worst-case scenario in many ways, in which the loser says, well, it's illegitimate. They didn't win correctly. But again, I come back to confidence in people. You know, whining is not really in the American character. And we have a lot of flaws, but that's generally not in our character.
Right.
And the player who complains about the refs' calls and the game being rigged by the gamblers, they rarely get very far here.
Yeah.
But there is some, I don't want to dodge your question, there is some real danger if the tradition of losing presidential candidates, even in breathtakingly close elections, the 2000 election comes to mind. Al Gore won the total vote, but he lost oh so narrowly in the electoral vote by losing in Florida. But after a certain amount of time, he did what his predecessors, that is, losers in presidential campaigns, he did, and that is fade and say, look, I don't like it, I may have my questions about it, but for the good of the country, we need to move on.
Right.
So the winner takes over.
Right.
But there is this danger, and increasingly, Donald Trump has seemed to lay the groundwork for doing that same thing, and also laying the groundwork. It talks in terms of if we don't win, it's a revolution. That's not a direct quote, but certainly people around him talk in those terms. This is why, you know, it's dangerous ground we're walking on here.
Right.
As a story, as a journalist, yes, it's a very exciting time, because it does make a difference who's elected this time.
Yeah.
It'll make a big difference. But I think my base camp is take a deep breath, stay steady. Let's see what happens over this next week.
I won't put you on the spot by asking you to predict who the next president will be, but can you tell me what you think their gender might be?
I think maybe transgender. Look, I don't mind playing the game with you. I think that, if you had to bet your mother's back 40, which I hope you don't have to do, I still think you'd bet on Hillary Clinton. But things have narrowed down this week. The FBI director is releasing this email headline,
yeah,
which for the moment all it was a headline. It's hurt her. It particularly hurt her in some key areas that she needs. But if you had to bet it, you would bet Hillary Clinton. But I hope you don't have to bet it, because there is a possibility, I reckon it's a strong possibility, that there is a so-called silent vote for Trump that has not been heard from. Mm-hmm. I've never agreed with the phrase silent majority, because that assumes a majority. But there may be in this election a larger group of voters, particularly in some key states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, who just stay quiet because they think may not be popular, maybe a little unseemly to come out for Trump, who show up. But, you know, last night, election night is going to be fairly easy, I think. That if you see early election night that Donald Trump has carried Pennsylvania, then you're going to say to yourself, we better put a pot of coffee on, because this is going to go a very, very long time, and he could win. Yeah. If, on the other hand, in the early going, if you see that Pennsylvania is pretty clearly going for Hillary Clinton, if you're a Clinton fan, you can breathe not a complete sigh of relief, but say, she's probably going to win it. Mm-hmm.
You talked about Comey in the investigation. Donald Trump said today that Emailgate is worse than Watergate. You covered Watergate. We saw that wonderful clip of you and Richard Nixon in 1973. Is that a fair comparison?
No. Look, he has no evidence. And again, I try hard to be respectful both campaigns. But here's a case when somebody says something that's demonstrably untrue, then it needs to be said that's untrue.
Right.
Because he does not have one scintilla of evidence that what she has done with the emails at the worst is an impeachable offense.
Right.
Much less, up to now, there's very little evidence it's a criminal offense, but he could make it that. But there's no evidence that. But this is the kind of hyperbole that has lowered the race, and this is by no means the worst that he has said, or for that matter, she has said. But again, I think most people recognize that for what it is.
Yeah.
I hope they do. His biggest problems are not statements like that, which on the face of them you say, I'm for Donald Trump, but that's pretty ridiculous. We can make a list of Hillary Clinton's biggest problems, including talking about deplorables, which was a telling mistake on her part.
Right.
But with Donald Trump, the disparaging John McCain and his war record, on television, mimicking and mocking a person with physical disabilities, and how he handled the whole thing with the Khan family who lost a son in battle. I mean, these are the most telling negative things that Trump has done, less so this business about emails. For the life of me, I don't know how the emails in the end are going to cut.
Right.
That is, right now they put Hillary Clinton back on her heels, the momentum has gone to Trump, and so the atmospheric has been negative every day about Hillary Clinton and the emails. But keep in mind that in most states, somewhere between 30 and 40% of people who are going to vote have already voted. How much effect this last week and a half will have. Right. It also raises the possibility that the Clinton people will try to, this is possible, the Clinton people will try to offset this by unloading something of their own here in the last few days of the campaign.
Dan, you talked about that silent voter who might cast his or her vote for Donald Trump, but not want many people to know about it. Could you have the converse occur? Could you have, in your view, could you have the silent Hillary voter, someone who says, I'm in a Republican state or I'm in a Republican district, I don't want people to know this, but I'm going to cast my vote for Hillary Clinton?
Certainly could exist, particularly among women. If Hillary Clinton is to win, the winning margin, the cumulative vote will be made up of a lot of different aspects, but the winning margin for Hillary Clinton will be suburban white women.
Yeah.
For Donald Trump, if he were to win, the winning margin will be among white males in the middle and below socioeconomic class. I don't like to talk in terms of class, but nonetheless. When I say that Donald Trump has a path to victory, I agree it's a narrow path, that there is a path. Right. And that path, they pretty clearly outlined what the Trump people think the path is, and that is get a larger turnout and a larger percentage of white males at the polls than any Republican candidate has gotten, and certainly more than Mitt Romney got, to have a lower voter turnout among African Americans. They know they're going to lose big with African Americans, but they're just hoping against hope that the voter turnout with African Americans will be, and that the voter turnout among people of Latino heritage will be low. That's what they see as their path to victory. The Clinton people see as their path, which is a wider path. Maybe they get fewer African American heritage people voting for them than Obama did, understandably, but still get in the high 80%. That the Latino vote, so-called, turns out in bigger numbers than it has before, not necessarily overwhelming, and it's greater for her, and that she wins the battle for basically suburban women who tend to be Caucasian women. Right. That's her path.
Right. We're going to open up the mics for a couple of questions momentarily, and I would ask you to queue up now while I ask Dan this next question. Dan, What is the most important story you've covered in your career? I know that's a hard one, and it's been a long and prosperous career, but as you look back, what in your view is the most important story?
Well, you've covered my caveat that because I've been around a long time and because I've been lucky, 5 or 6 stories jumped on my mind. But always, at least at the top, or pretty near the top, was covering Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the fairly early stages, 1962, 1963, when that was virtually my full-time job to cover him. It changed me as a person, it changed me as a professional. It literally changed my life. And as an ongoing story, a still not completed story, if you will, I can make a case of that. For a story of a compact period of time, the Kennedy assassination, I think partly because it happened when I was just past 30 years old in a young time. But anytime you cover a war, it has to be when somebody asks you what's the most important story you've covered. Anytime you've covered, especially if it's your fellow countrymen and women fighting the war, it leaves a deep and lasting impression on you. But, I could make another list, but if you ask me one, I'd have to say, I guess Dr. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement.
Let's take questions from the audience. And we'll start over here to my left. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, excuse me. I heard on NPR today that you have a documentary premiering on Mark Cuban Network. Is that true, or did I
think what they must have been referring to, I didn't hear that particular broadcast, that we have finished a documentary that is, in fact, what's tonight? Tonight's Tuesday. Yes, it's playing tonight. This is a 1-hour program, a little more than an hour program, which is called America Divided, The Rise of Trump, subheaded Donald Trump, How, Why, and Why You Should Care. And that's what I think they must have been referring to. It'll be broadcast on Access, that's AXS TV, which is cable and satellite television. At least be broadcast there several times tonight and repeated during the week. If we can find another venue for it, we will do so. But that unquestionably is what they were referring to.
Right.
Thank you.
Next question. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm Ginger Wiltshire Mitchell, and big fan of yours and your work and your talk tonight. My question is 2-part. What one little or big thing, what one thing would you do differently in your career or change if you could? And the second one is, I'm interested to know what being a Texan means to you. The Texas state of mind, our heritage, has that influenced you or had an effect on yourself or your career over the years?
First of all, thank you for your compliment. And in answer to your questions, number one, there's a long list of things that I would do differently in the career. If I had to pick one, it would probably be, I was not for a long time as sensitive about my family responsibilities as I should have been. In my zeal to make of myself a good reporter, even a great reporter, things like the first time I went to the Vietnam War, I stayed the better part of a year and left my wife Jean in London, where we had been transferred only shortly before I went to Vietnam. But I left Jean in London, where she knew very few people, with 2 young children, aged 6 and 4.5, and stayed in Vietnam, I say, for the better part of a year. You don't get to play them over. Your question is, what would I change? That I've tried to be as good a father and as good a husband as I could be, but I know that there were times when I spent too much time on the road, too much time chasing stories, and not enough time at home. Now, thanks to Jean, both the children turned out very well, but you asked me what I'd change. That's one thing I would change. When I first came to work at CBS News, we mentioned the civil rights movement. I was home, the first year I worked for CBS, over a 12-month period, I was home 31 days out of the year. The second year I was with them, I was home 42 days out of the year. You can say, well, boy, that's dedication to your craft, but it's a little too much. And looking back on it, what would I change? I'd be I'd give the family more time, particularly in the children's early years, even if it meant passing on a good story. Now, as for being a Texan, quickly, Don, that I was advised particularly when I came into the anchor chair succeeding Walter Cronkite, that I should dial it back on being a Texan. No, there were people who'd taken a big chance on me and were serious. But what I had already found as being a field correspondent for 20 years is that a sense of home and a sense of place, a sense of where I belonged in the end and where I was going to be buried, where I was born, where I was going to be buried, all those long and yes, lonely nights, plane rides across the Pacific or across the Atlantic and into the depths of Africa or in some place I'd never been in Southeast Asia, it was very important to have a sense of place. And Texas always was that sense of place for me. And in that sense, it has meant a tremendous amount to me, because when you travel as much as I have, if you aren't careful, you lose what I call your center of gravity or your gyroscope. It's very hard to, in the end, when you say, who am I, what am I, and where do I belong? If you aren't careful when you're traveling and away from home for a long time, it's easy to lose a sense of that. And always having a sense of being not just from Texas, but of Texas, has helped me insofar as I've been able to do it, hold myself together. Thank you.
Yeah. We respect you. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Last question. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned that we are now in this post-truth era. People of my age have always regarded truth as sort of one of the highest callings and qualities of a politician. We seem to have moved totally away from that. Why do you think that has happened?
Well, that pauses because I'm not sure why it has happened. Just as an observer of the scene and somebody covering politics for a long time, I think it has happened. It is in the process of happening. I think some of it has to do with modern means of communication, which is to say, we have 24-hour days, 7-day-a-week television. Last time I tuned in my satellite television, I think I had 400 or 500 at least television channels. So I think it has something to do with the number of media outlets one has. But I also think we have to blame ourselves, which is we the people, as Lincoln would speak of them. We've gotten a little cavalier about, well, he's lying, or she's lying, but you know what, they're entertaining. Or, well, yes, he or she is lying, but the other person is lying more. And frankly, I think collectively in societal terms, we've gotten lazy. So you say, why has it happened? One, we have a new breed of politician who is willing to, in effect, say, I don't care if you prove that I'm lying. I'm going to keep saying it, because if I keep saying it often enough, there are going to be enough people who believe it. But as with the audience, there's been too much of a tendency, I would say led by journalists in general. Journalists, up until a certain point of this campaign, were really loath to call anybody a liar or to say a lie was a lie. You could say, well, he's a little lazy with the truth or something. So, a combination of those factors, a new breed of politician who is, if you want to call it that way, gutsy enough or unconscionable enough to say, I don't care if they prove what I'm saying is untrue. I'm going to keep saying it because enough people will believe it. and a press too slow to say what they know and say and press home the point that when the thing is a lie, there's a dictionary definition for a lie. When it's a demonstrable, unquestionable lie, to call it such and to call the candidate's hand on it. And the third, we have to blame ourselves for people who say we've gotten fairly used to it. I want to emphasize, I'm not sure that we're completely in to a post-truth political era. What I'm raising is we're pretty far into it, and if we don't put a stop to it right away, we'll be completely into it by the next presidential cycle. Thanks.
Dan,
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to, Dan, I'm going to quote our questioner over here, and who paid you a very high compliment and one that's very well deserved. We respect you. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your great career. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much.